In the storm-battered Sea View Cove, Frank Miller, a weathered fisherman, risks his life to save a stranger from the raging sea. The man, Dan, bears scars and a military tattoo, hinting at a hidden past. As rumors swirl and government agents descend, Frank shelters Dan, trusting an unspoken bond forged by their shared Navy history. The truth unravels. Dan is Rear Admiral Daniel Reeves, presumed dead, carrying dangerous secrets. Frank's quiet heroism, rooted in a forgotten act aboard the USS Constellation, earns him long overdue recognition. But who else hides untold stories of courage in plain sight? If Frank's story of quiet heroism moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Join us in celebrating everyday heroes by sharing your own stories in the comments. Let's inspire each other to notice the unsung courage around us. Together we can honor what truly matters. The night was torn apart by a voice, sharp and unyielding, slicing through the quiet like a blade. "Are you sheltering a fugitive?" it demanded as a cold beam of light stabbed into the dim interior of the old cabin. Frank Miller's heart slammed against his ribs, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down despite the damp chill that clung to the air, carried in from the restless sea just beyond the cabin's weathered walls. He's not a fugitive, Frank thought, the words burning in his mind like a quiet vow. He's a man the world turned its back on, a man it forgot to honor. Outside, the ocean held its breath, the waves falling silent as if in reverence. Then slowly, a black submarine broke the surface, rising from the depths with a quiet menace that commanded the night. Its sleek form glistened under the moonlight, a shadow given shape, and Frank's chest tightened with a mix of awe and resolve. In that moment, he understood something profound. Some men don't run because they're guilty. They run because they carry burdens too vast, too heavy for the world to comprehend. As the submarine's conning tower pierced the sky, Frank lifted his chin, his weathered face set with determination. He wasn't seeking answers or absolution. No, he was ready for the world to finally see, to remember, who was worth remembering. For nearly 50 years, Frank Miller had lived in rhythm with the sea. Each morning he cast his nets into the cold, churning waters off Sea View Cove, watching the sunrise spill gold across the waves before retreating to his small, salt-worn cabin. The sea had been his constant, his companion in solitude, his rival in storms, his comfort in grief. It had been there when he was a young man, full of fire and dreams, and it remained now as his hair grayed and his shoulders stooped. Once there had been another presence in his life, Martha, his wife, whose laughter had filled the cabin like sunlight. She'd danced to the crackle of the old radio, her hands kneading dough for fresh bread that warmed the air on chilly mornings. But Martha had been gone for 15 years, taken by a quiet illness that no doctor could outrun. Her absence left a hollow that the sea could never fill, and since then, it had been just Frank, his boat, and the endless horizon stretching out before him. Sea View Cove had transformed in ways Frank could never have imagined. The sleepy fishing village of his youth, with its handful of bait shops and greasy spoon diners, had given way to a bustling summer hotspot, where ramshackle huts once leaned into the coastal winds, luxury condos now perched on the cliffs, their glass windows glinting like the eyes of some indifferent beast. The waterfront, once alive with the creak of working boats, was now crowded with kayaks and paddleboards, the laughter of tourists drowning out the gulls. Frank observed it all with a quiet resignation, the kind that comes from knowing nothing, not even a town, stays the same forever. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch, pipe in hand, the distant sound of children playing on the beach drifting to him. Their joy was sweet, yet it stirred a pang in his chest, a sharp reminder of all he'd lost. He often wondered what Martha would have thought of the town's new vibrancy. Would she have delighted in its energy, or mourned the quiet charm that had once defined it? The question lingered unanswered in the salt-stained corners of his heart. Loneliness had crept into Frank's life like a tide, slow and unnoticed, until it had settled into every crevice of his existence. It wasn't something he fought or resented. It was simply there, a silent partner in his days. At 60, he'd made a kind of peace with growing older, with the ache in his joints and the way the world seemed to shrink a little more each year. But in the hush before dawn, when the sea was still and the first light hesitated over the cove, or in the last moments of twilight and as the horizon swallowed the sun, Frank couldn't help but wonder, did the world remember men like him? Men who'd lived quietly, loved fiercely, and endured? The storm that night came with a ferocity Frank hadn't anticipated. The wind screamed through the rigging of his small fishing boat, tossing it against the waves like a child's toy. Rain stung his face in cold, needle-sharp bursts, and salt spray blurred his vision, turning the world into a chaotic haze. Frank squinted into the dusk, his fingers numb as they clutched the tiller, fighting to steer toward the faint glow of his cabin on the shore. He knew these waters like he knew his own heartbeat, knew when to push, when to yield. But as the wind roared and the sky darkened, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement that sent a jolt through his chest. There, in the raging surf, a human figure bobbed wildly, arms thrashing, head dipping beneath the waves. A flash of skin, pale against the slate-gray sea, and Frank's breath caught. For a heartbeat, he was paralyzed. His first thought was primal, born of survival. It's too late. No one makes it this far out. His second was colder, wearier. This isn't your fight, old man. Go home. You've given enough. But then came the third, rising from a place deep within him, where the memory of his Navy days lived. The part that had pulled comrades from burning wreckage. The part that Martha had always said made him more than he believed himself to be. "If I don't go, who will, damn fool?" he growled to himself, his voice lost in the storm's howl. With a fierce tug, he wrestled the boat around, his chest tight as the engine strained against the swells. The vessel groaned, its timbers creaking like the bones of some ancient beast as it battled the waves. His heart thundered beneath his raincoat, salt bitter on his lips, the cold seeping into his bones. As he neared, the figure took shape, a man, perhaps in his 50s, gasping for air, his kicks feeble against the sea's relentless pull. Each wave battered him, dragging him under, the ocean claiming him inch by inch. Frank grabbed the life preserver and threw it with all his strength, the orange ring skittering across the water. "Hang on, you stubborn bastard," he shouted, the wind snatching his words. The man's fingers grazed the ring but slipped, his body sinking again. Without a moment's thought, without weighing the key-toss, Frank tied the rope to the cleat, shed his coat away, and dove into the icy water. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing his breath, locking at his chest, and setting his skin ablaze with pain. "You're 72, you old idiot," his mind hissed. But Frank was already moving, his arms slicing through the waves. He'd never been one to back down, not when his mind screamed quit, not when the odds were stacked against him. Inch by agonizing inch, he fought the sea, his body screaming, his lungs burning. When he reached the stranger, the man barely had the strength to lift his head, his eyes dim with exhaustion. Frank hooked an arm around him, feeling the faint shudder of life in the man's chest, waterlogged frame. The weight was immense, the current relentless, but Frank held on, his own heart pounding with a fierce, defiant will. "Not today," he thought. "You're not taking him today." The stranger's breath came in desperate, shuddering gasps, hot against Frank's cheek as he dragged the man through the churning sea. Each wave clawed at them, the ocean's relentless hunger threatening to swallow them both. Frank's legs quaked beneath him, his lungs burned with every ragged inhale, and his arms felt like they'd been forged from lead, heavy and unyielding. Yet something fiercer than exhaustion drove him forward, a stubborn, bone-deep refusal to let go. His vision swam as they neared the boat, the world blurring into smears of gray and black. Through sheer grit, Frank hauled the stranger over the side, their bodies collapsing in a sodden heap on the deck. The boat pitched wildly beneath them, tossed by the storm's fury, and for a long moment they lay there gasping, shivering, soaked to the bone. Frank's hands trembled as he fumbled for a blanket, his fingers numb from the cold. As he draped it over the stranger, his hand grazed the man's arm, brushing against something rough and faded. A tattoo, its ink dulled by years but still legible. A military insignia, unmistakable even in the dim light. Frank's breath hitched, a jolt of recognition cutting through the fog of exhaustion. He didn't have time to dwell on it. The stranger's lips were tinged blue, his voice a faint, broken whisper. "How far to shore?" Frank leaned closer, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the storm's roar. 20 minutes, he murmured, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Just hold on, son." The stranger managed a faint nod, his eyes fluttering shut as unconsciousness claimed him. Frank tightened the blanket around the man's trembling frame, his hands moving with a quiet urgency. He turned the boat toward the distant cabin light, a faint beacon flickering through the rain like a star on the edge of oblivion. His grip on the tiller was unsteady, his knuckles white, but his eyes never left the shore. A voice in his head, sharp and accusing, needled him one last time. "Why risk yourself?" Frank's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. "Because some things, old man," he muttered under his breath, "you just don't walk away from." Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and seawater. The old wood stove hissed and crackled, its warmth pushing back the chill that clung to everything. Outside, the storm raged on, its howl rattling the windows. But within these walls, a fragile stillness held sway. Frank knelt beside the stranger, his hands working methodically as he peeled away the man's sodden clothes, replacing them with dry flannel and sweatpants from his own sparse wardrobe. The stranger's skin was pale, almost translucent, his body trembling with the threat of hypothermia. As Frank worked, his eyes caught the tattoo again. Navy, no question. The insignia was faded, but it stirred something deep in Frank's chest, a memory of salt and steel and the weight of duty. The scars told a louder story. Thin, precise lines traced across the stranger's ribs. A jagged gash marred his shoulder, and an old surgical scar ran along his thigh. These weren't the haphazard marks of a careless life. They were the deliberate etchings of war, of survival. Frank's hands paused, hovering over the tattoo, his mind slipping back half a century. He was a young sailor again, barely 20, standing on the deck of the USS Constellation in the early 70s. The South China Sea stretched endless and shimmering under a merciless sun. Those years had been a grueling mix of monotony and terror, long stretches of routine shattered by sudden fires, accidents, or the scream of alarms in the night. The crew had been his lifeline, their bond forged in shared danger, a trust no civilian could ever grasp. Veterans carried that bond in their bones, in the way they moved, the way their eyes scanned a room, the scars they didn't bother to explain. Frank saw it now in this stranger, this man who lay shivering in his bed, fighting to hold on. Frank settled into the creaking wooden chair by the stove, his gaze lingering on the stranger's face. He didn't know the man's name, didn't know the roads that had led him here, but none of that seemed to matter. There was a connection between them, unspoken but undeniable, written in the ink of their tattoos and the weight of their silences. Frank's life had been a solitary one these past decades, his days filled with the rhythm of the sea and the quiet of his own thoughts. He'd grown accustomed to the solitude, but now, watching this stranger fight for breath, he felt the stirrings of something older, something he'd buried long ago, duty, perhaps, or the instinct to protect what the sea tried to claim. The storm battered the cabin through the night, its wind screaming like a living thing. Frank kept watch, his eyes heavy but unyielding, listening to the stranger's ragged breaths in the deep, ceaseless voice of the ocean beyond. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a strange, heavy quiet in its wake, as if the world were holding its breath. Frank stood at the cabin window, a chipped mug of coffee warming his hands, his eyes tracing the waves as they lapped gently against the rocky shore. Behind him, the stranger stirred, his name finally offered in a voice rough as gravel. He had the look of a man who read every room before opening his mouth, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion still clinging to him. Even half recovered, Dan moved with a careful precision, his gaze flicking to the windows, the door, the stove, as if mentally charting every detail of the space. He positioned himself with his back to the wall, his movements deliberate, avoiding any angle where he might be seen from outside. Frank recognized that vigilance, that hyper-awareness honed by years of living on the edge of danger. He'd seen it in men on ships, in sailors who'd survived ambushes or storms, their instincts forever tuned to the next threat. Dan carried that same weight, though Frank couldn't guess what he was running from or toward. For a while, Frank said nothing, his hands occupied with the familiar task of repairing a net. He pretended not to notice Dan's wariness, the way his eyes never stopped moving, always scanning. Questions burned in Frank's mind. Who was this man, really? What had driven him into the sea's grasp? But he kept them locked away, respecting the unspoken code of men like them. Perhaps it was the old Navy habit of minding his own business, or perhaps it was something deeper, a quiet reverence for the burdens Dan carried. Burdens Frank knew too well. Down in Sea Cove, the whispers had already spreading. Frank wasn't surprised. The town fed on gossip, especially in the off-season, when the tourists vanished, and the days dragged on slow and gray. Folks had seen his boat limp into the harbor, had glimpsed the figure he'd carried into the cabin, and now the rumors were piling up like driftwood. At the market, a neighbor had sidled up, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "You all right out there last night?" he'd asked, his tone light but fishing for something juicier. Frank had offered little more than a weathered smile, the kind that gave nothing away, and changed the subject. He knew the town would talk, but he didn't need to know the truth was heavier than any story they could invent. Back in the cabin, the air between Frank and Dan remained thick with unspoken words. Frank busied himself with small tasks, his movements steady, his mind restless. Dan watched, his silence louder than any confession. The sea rolled on outside, its rhythm eternal, and Frank felt the weight of it all. The storm, the stranger, the scars, the tattoos, the shared past that bound them. For now, it was enough to keep watch, to let the man breathe, to answer the call that had pulled him into the waves. Some things, Frank thought, you just didn't walk away from. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile calm that clung to the air like damp moss. At the cabin nestled in the rugged embrace of Sea View Cove, Frank sat in his worn armchair, the weight of the quiet pressing against his chest. Across the room, Dan paced relentlessly by the window, his silhouette carved sharp against the gray light filtering through the glass. Every step Dan took seemed to carry a restless energy, a coiled tension that spoke of secrets too heavy to share. Frank's eyes traced the rigid lines of Dan's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The space between them hummed with unspoken words, a silent agreement that some truths needed time to surface, if they ever would. Frank considered breaking the stillness, his lips parting briefly, but he swallowed the urge. He'd learned long ago that some men carried burdens too raw to be prodded, stories that might never find voice. Instead, he let the silence stretch, thick and unbroken, trusting that Dan would speak when he was ready, or not at all. As the afternoon waned, the sharp crunch of tires on gravel snapped Frank from his thoughts. He rose, coffee cup still warm in his calloused hand, and stepped onto the porch. Two black SUVs rolled to a stop near the cabin, their engines idling with a low, predatory hum. Tinted windows hid the occupants, but the vehicle's sleek exteriors screamed authority, out of place in the salt-worn simplicity of Sea View Cove. Three men emerged, their tailored suits as foreign here as a city skyscraper. The tallest, a man with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, introduced himself as Mr. Miller. He flashed a badge, the motion too quick for Frank to catch the details, but the glint of metal was enough to stir unease in his gut. "Mind if we ask a few questions?" Miller's voice was smooth, practiced, but it carried an edge that set Frank's nerves on alert. Frank nodded slowly, his stance rooted on the porch, eyes steady but wary. Miller's gaze didn't waver as he spoke. "We're looking for someone. Possible illegal entry into U.S. waters. He's injured. Could be dangerous." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Frank's thoughts. He kept his expression neutral, a skill honed over decades of keeping his own counsel. "Haven't seen anyone but the gulls," he replied, his voice even, betraying nothing. The agents exchanged a glance, a silent conversation Frank wasn't privy to. "Mind if we look around?" Miller pressed, his tone polite but insistent. Frank's lips curved into a thin, humorless smile. "Free country, isn't it?" he said, stepping aside with a gesture that was more challenge than invitation. Inside, Dan was gone. Frank's heart had barely skipped a beat that morning when Dan slipped out, his movements swift and silent. A single nod had passed between them, an unspoken pact forged in the quiet of dawn. Dan had vanished into the rocky cove behind the cabin, a jagged stretch of coastline where Frank used to cast lines as a boy, the sea's secrets safe in its crags. Now, as the agent swept through his home, Frank stood by the door, his chest tight with a familiar distrust. He'd never been one for rebellion, but authority, men in uniforms who forgot the people they served, had always left a sour taste in his mouth. He watched them lift blankets, open cupboards, their polished shoes scuffing the worn wooden floor that had held his life's memories. Their presence felt like an invasion, their questions probing not just his home, but the very instincts that had guided him through 72 hard years. When they finally left, Miller handed Frank a card with a number scrawled on it, along with a warning to call if he saw anything. The card felt heavier than it should, a tangible reminder of the choice looming over him. That evening, Frank sat by the fire, the card resting on the table like an accusation. His mind churned, wrestling with the decision to turn in a man he barely knew, or to trust the gut instinct that had never steered him wrong. The flames crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls, mirroring the conflict within him. Dan's face flickered in his thoughts. Haunted, guarded. A man carrying more than just wounds. Frank's fingers brushed the card, its edges crisp against his weathered skin. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he let it fall into the fire. The paper curled and blackened, consumed by the flames. Some things, Frank decided, weren't for the government to settle. Loyalty, in its rawest form, was about trusting a man's silence over a badge's demands. By sunrise, Dan was gone. Frank woke to the familiar hush of the sea, the cot where Dan had slept now empty, the blanket folded neatly as if no one had ever been there. The faint trace of boot prints in the dirt outside was the only proof Dan had existed at all. Frank stood at the window, coffee untouched, watching the waves roll in. A quiet heaviness settled in his chest, not of regret but of acceptance. He wasn't surprised. Men like Dan, shadowed by ghosts, rarely stayed long. Their paths crossed briefly, like ships in the fog, before drifting apart. Word traveled fast in Sea View Cove. At the bait shop, glances lingered a little too long, sharp with unspoken questions. At the market, conversations carried a new weight, curiosity laced with suspicion. "You have company up there, Frank?" one neighbor asked, her tone probing. "Heard some strangers came by looking for someone." Frank offered a non-committal shrug, his face a mask of indifference, but inside the questions gnawed at him. Rumors swelled like the tide. Some whispered he was harboring a criminal, others that age had softened his judgment. He felt the shift in the town's pulse, the way old friends hesitated before shaking his hand, their eyes searching his for answers he wouldn't give. The weight of their judgment pressed against him, but it couldn't shake the quiet conviction that had guided his choice. Alone in his cabin that night, Frank sat by the fire, the events of the past days turning over in his mind like stones smoothed by the sea. He wondered if loyalty still held value in a world that thrived on suspicion, where trust was a currency few dared to spend. He hadn't asked Dan for his story, hadn't needed to. Something in the man's weary eyes had spoken louder than words, a truth Frank understood instinctively. A man on the run wasn't always fleeing guilt. Sometimes he was searching for a moment's refuge, a chance to breathe before the shadows caught up. The town's whispers couldn't touch that truth, couldn't unravel the peace Frank had made with his decision. As the fire burned low, he leaned back, the wind's rhythm outside a steady reminder of the world demanded. Loyalty, he thought, wasn't about explanations or approval. It was about standing firm when the world swayed, about holding space for a stranger when no one else would. The darkness still clung to the cabin when the rumble of engines shattered the quiet. Frank stepped onto the porch, pulling his coat tight against the morning's bite, as 3 military Humvees rolled to a stop. Men in naval uniforms emerged, their movements brisk, efficient, a stark contrast to the sleepy cove. A young officer approached, his face calm but firm, his eyes carrying a weight of purpose. Mr. Miller, we need you to come with us. It's a matter of national security. Frank's instinct was scream to resist, to demand answers. But something in the officer's tone told him it was a battle he couldn't win. With a quiet sigh, he grabbed his coat and followed. The cold metal of the Humvee's door, a stark reminder of how small he was in the face of such power. The drive was long, winding through back roads Frank had never seen, the coastline fading into unfamiliar hills. Checkpoints, security gates, and armed guards marked every turn, each one tightening the knot in his gut. He was led through a maze into corridors, past locked doors and guarded rooms, until he reached a stark conference room, its walls lined with flags and insignia that spoke of a world far beyond Sea View Cove. Minutes past ticked by, each one heavier than the last, until the door opened. A man stepped inside, his posture straight, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. Frank barely recognized him, but when their eyes met, the truth hit him like a wave. It was Dan. The salt-laced breeze tugged at Franklin Miller's weathered coat as he stood on the rocky bluff overlooking the Sea View Cove, the dawn painting the horizon in hues of pink and gold. The sea stretched out before him, smooth as glass, whispering secrets it had kept for decades. Frank's hands were buried deep in his pockets, his boots still dusted with sand from the morning's walk. He wasn't sure why the Navy had asked him to be here at this precise moment, but the weight of their request hung heavy in his chest, stirring a quiet unease. His life had been one of routine, mending nets, casting lines, and watching the tides roll in and out. Yet today something felt different, as though the world was holding its breath alongside him. Far out on the water, a ripple broke the stillness. Frank's eyes narrowed, his breath catching as the sleek black form of a submarine rose from the depths. It emerged with a grace that felt almost otherworldly, like a leviathan from some ancient tale, its hull gleaming faintly in the early light. The sight sent a shiver through him, not of fear but of awe, a reminder of the hidden forces that moved beneath the surface of the world he thought he knew. On the deck, a lone figure appeared, standing tall in a crisp naval uniform. Even from this distance, Frank recognized him. Rear Admiral Daniel Reeves. Dan's silhouette was unmistakable, his posture radiating a quiet authority forged by years of service. Their eyes met across the water, and for a moment time seemed to pause. Then, with a precision that spoke of a lifetime of discipline, Dan raised his hand in a formal salute. Frank stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs. The gesture was more than a salute. It was a recognition, a bridge across years of silence and sacrifice. His eyes stung with unshed tears, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades rising to the surface. Slowly, with a resolve he didn't know he still possessed, Frank lifted his own hand, returning the salute. No words passed between them, no grand declarations or fanfare, just two men bound by a shared understanding that few could ever grasp. As the submarine slipped back beneath the waves, vanishing as silently as it had appeared, Frank felt a weight settle in his chest. Not heavy, but grounding, a sense of being seen at last. Behind him, the crunch of boots on gravel broke the silence. A young officer stood waiting, his expression solemn, yet respectful. Without a word, he extended a folded American flag, its stars vivid against the deep blue, its edges crisp as if untouched by time. Attached to it was a small brass plaque, its surface etched with simple words, "To Franklin Miller for acts of quiet heroism." Frank's hands trembled as he accepted the flag, cradling it against his chest as though it were something alive, something fragile. Pride swelled within him, but it was tempered by something deeper. Peace, perhaps, or the quiet relief of knowing that the world had finally remembered. Years ago, Frank had been a different man, a sailor aboard the USS Constellation in 1972. The memory of that day still lingered, sharp and vivid despite the decades that had passed. The engine room fire had erupted without warning, flames licking at the walls, smoke choking the air. 3 of his fellow sailors had been trapped, their shouts barely audible over the roar of the blaze. Frank hadn't thought twice. He'd plunged into the heat, his shoulders searing as he dragged each man to safety. The scars still marked his skin, faint but ever present, a silent testament to a moment he'd buried deep. The mission had been classified, the heroics buried under layers of paperwork and secrecy. No one had spoken of it again, And Frank had returned to his life, marriage, fishing, quiet days by the sea, carrying the weight of that day alone. Now, standing on the bluff, the flag in his arms, Frank felt those memories shift. They were no longer just his to carry. The Navy had known all this time, and now they were making it right. The ceremony that followed was unexpected, a moment Frank hadn't prepared for. The compound's main hall smelled of polished wood and naval brass, the air thick with formality. Men and women in uniform lined the room, their faces a mix of respect and quiet pride. Frank felt out of place, a weathered fisherman in his old coat, his boots still carrying the grit of the shore. Admiral Michael Lawson stepped forward, his presence commanding yet warm, a small velvet box in his hands. "Franklin Miller," he began, his voice steady and clear. "For actions aboard the USS Constellation in 1972, where you risked your life to save 3 fellow sailors from a fire in the engine room, today we correct a long overdue oversight." The room fell silent as Lawson opened the box, revealing a medal that caught the light with a sign, understated glow. Frank's throat tightened, his breath shallow. For decades, he'd carried that day in silence, expecting nothing. Not recognition, not thanks. The weight of the medal, as it was pinned to his chest, was more than physical. It was a validation of a life lived quietly, of choices made when no one was watching. Pride surged through him, but so did a deeper emotion, a sense of connection, of finally being seen after years of standing on the edges of the world. Beside him, Admiral Reeves offered a quiet nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Though decades separated them, they were bound not by rank or circumstance, but by the unspoken courage that defined them both. Later, as the hall emptied, Frank sat alone, his fingers tracing the edges of the medal. His thoughts drifted to the countless others like him, men and women who had done the right thing without expectation of reward, whose stories lived only in the hearts of those they'd saved. Heroes, he realized, often went unnoticed, their sacrifices fading into the background of a world that moved on. But sometimes, just sometimes, the world paused to remember. In the weeks that followed, life in Sea View Cove returned to its familiar rhythm. The tides ebbed and flowed, gulls wheeled overhead, and Frank resumed his quiet routines, mending nets, casting his boat out at dawn, walking the rocky shore at sunset. Yet something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The neighbors' glances lingered a little longer now, their nods carrying a new respect. The flag and medal rested on his mantle, not as trophies but as quiet reminders of a life that had mattered. Each morning as he stood on the bluff watching the sea, Frank felt a peace he hadn't known he'd been seeking. He'd lived unseen for so long, doing what needed to be done, asking for nothing. And now, in the most unexpected way, the world had answered, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, enduring acknowledgement that carried him home. Frank Miller was not the kind of man who sought the spotlight, yet it seemed to find him in the quiet moments, when a neighbor lingered a bit longer to exchange a warm greeting, or when a curious stranger rapped gently on the door of his modest cabin, eager to hear his story straight from the source. He never puffed out his chest or spun grand tales. When pressed, his words were simple, almost understated. "I just did what any decent person would." But beneath that plain-spoken humility, a subtle glow of pride flickered in his heart. For so long, his actions had gone unnoticed, tucked away like a well-kept secret. Now, at last, he felt seen, his quiet courage acknowledged by those who took the time to listen. Inside his small cabin, a folded American flag rested on the mantel, its crisp edges a solemn reminder of sacrifice and duty. Beside it sat a faded photograph of Martha, her smile frozen in time, radiating a warmth that still tugged at Frank's heart. Next to that was his old Navy cap, its fabric worn thin from years of wear, a relic of a younger man who'd once sailed across oceans with dreams bigger than himself. On quiet evenings, Frank's fingers would trace the edges of a brass plaque that shared space on the mantel, its inscription a testament to a moment when he'd chosen to act, to stand tall when it mattered most. As he touched the cool metal, his mind wandered to the crossroads of life, those fleeting, often invisible moments when a person decides to speak up, to lend a hand, or to hold fast to what's right, even when no one's there to applaud. Frank knew better than most that heroism wasn't always loud or adorned with medals. It didn't always march in uniform or bask in the glow of public praise. Sometimes it was as simple as the neighbor who knocked on your door after a storm, making sure you were safe. It was the stranger who pulled over on a rainy night to help change a flat tire, their hands smeared with grease, their only reward a grateful nod. It was the parent who, through gritted teeth and sleepless nights, taught their child to choose the harder path if it was the right one. These were the acts that wove the fabric of a community, the quiet stitches that held it together. Frank often found himself on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. He'd sit there, rocking gently in his chair, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present, marveling at how much the world had changed, yet how much remained the same. The weight of his own story and the countless untold stories of others pressed gently on his heart. How many other acts of quiet bravery, he wondered, lived in the shadows of every town, every village, every family? How many heroes walked among us, their courage hidden behind unassuming faces? Frank's story wasn't just a memory, it was a mirror, reflecting a truth that felt especially urgent in a world that often raced past the small, meaningful moments. In modern America, where social media amplified the loudest voices and the flashiest deeds, Frank's life stood as a quiet rebellion. He hadn't chased glory or headlines. He didn't need the validation of 1,000 likes or a viral post. He'd simply done what was right, in the moment it was needed, without a soul watching. That choice, that uncelebrated strength, carried a weight that no trending topic could match. It was the kind of strength that showed up in the neighbor who dropped off groceries during a blizzard, or the veteran who spent his weekends mentoring kids, passing on lessons hard-learned in his youth. It was the grandparent who, through stories told over cups of coffee, taught resilience not as a buzzword, but as a way of life, steady, unyielding, and rooted in love. As Frank's story unfolded, it invited a deeper reflection, a pause to consider the unsung heroes in our own lives. How many people in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our families carried stories of sacrifice and kindness that went unnoticed? There was the coworker who stayed late to help a struggling colleague, never mentioning it to anyone. The teenager who stood up for a classmate being bullied, even at the cost of their own social standing. The single parent who, despite exhaustion, showed up every day with a smile, teaching their kids the value of perseverance. These were the threads of courage that wove through every community, often overlooked in a world that prized the loud over the lasting. Frank's life was a gentle nudge to slow down, to look closer, to see the quiet strength that surrounded us every day. His story left a lingering question, one that settled in the heart like a seed waiting to grow. Who were the unsung heroes in our own lives? Who was the person whose quiet act of kindness had changed us, even if we'd never told them? Maybe it was time to notice, to listen, to share those stories. In doing so, we might uncover a tapestry of courage and compassion that stretched far beyond what we'd imagined, reminding us that goodness, real, enduring goodness, still thrived in the world, waiting to be seen.